Hi, welcome back to the photographycourse.net YouTube channel. In this video, I'd like to talk to you about a little function on your camera called exposure compensation. And you'll need to know how to use this if you enjoy using your camera in any of the auto or semi-auto modes. Getting well exposed photographs is one of the key things you like to do as a photographer, and the exposure compensation can help you to do this in auto or semi-auto modes. It can get you out of some tricky situations. So let me explain. Setting your exposure is a matter of balancing three different things. These are the three components of the exposure triangle. It's your aperture, your shutter speed, and the ISO. And the ISO has a bit of a different function, but it still does have an effect on whether your photo is going to be too bright or too dark. When you've got your camera in manual mode, you're in control of these three adjustments. If you're using an auto or semi-auto mode, the camera is going to be in control of the exposure, and it doesn't always get it the way you want it to look. And so this is where the exposure compensation button comes in. If you're using aperture priority, shutter priority, or program mode, you'll be able to make good use of exposure compensation when you see that your camera is choosing an exposure that is either too bright or too dark. If you're using some of the other auto modes, such as scene modes, exposure compensation may not work. It depends on the brand of camera that you're using. So when a camera is deciding what the exposure should be, it's based on an algorithm that's programmed into the camera by a bunch of people somewhere in a lab. They don't actually know what you're photographing, they don't know what your subject is, and they don't know what the light's like where you are. But give them credit, really, they get it right most of the time. The AI in your camera is super intelligent and it is really quite incredible, but sometimes when you want to get a bit creative, or if the camera misjudges the amount of light or the contrast value in a scene, you'll want to compensate that using the exposure compensation feature. And this is usually a little button on my camera. It's right here, right where my forefinger is, right close to the shutter release button. It's usually easy to reach with a forefinger or a thumb so that it's accessible. So if you've got a scene that's either too bright or too dark, this is when you want to use the exposure compensation button. You press the button and then you can adjust the exposure value by turning a dial that's associated with it. And this will either brighten up your image or make it darker if it's too bright. When you use the exposure compensation, you'll be dialing in a measured amount of compensation, and this is called the EV, or the exposure value. It's often measured in 1/3 increments of 1 unit, and the 1 unit is 1 stop. So it's the same measurement as between your full stops on your aperture or your shutter speed or your ISO setting. So it's working with one of those three things to change the actual exposure to give you an image that looks right to you. And most cameras will give you the ability to adjust the exposure compensation by 3 to 5 stops of value. And practically, if you go to those extremes, that's making your photo a lot brighter or a lot darker. And you can dial this in usually at 1/3 stop increments. So you have quite a lot of control. So you may be thinking, when would I want to use the exposure compensation control? So in circumstances that when you've taken an image and you review it on your monitor and see that it's too bright, you'll want to dial in a negative exposure compensation value. Or on the other hand, if you look at an image and your subject is too dark, you can dial in a positive exposure compensation value. And how much you'll dial in depends on how bright or how dark your image is. And these situations quite often occur when you've got a subject that looks too dark because the background behind the subject is very bright. Say you've taken a portrait in front of a bright sky, and the person that you photographed is relatively small in your frame. Then you will notice that the camera will quite often underexpose your subject. So you'll want to brighten them up a little bit by pressing that exposure compensation button and then dialing in maybe 1 or 2 stops of exposure compensation, depending on how bright or how dark your subject is. Alternatively, you may want to adjust your exposure compensation to get a bit more creative with your exposures. As I said, your exposure in your camera when it's set to any auto or semi-auto mode is based on what it's been programmed to do. And this is smart, but it's not creative. You're creative. So when you take creative control and want your exposure to look different than what the camera offers, this is when you can use exposure compensation. Personally, I never use the exposure compensation dial on my camera because my camera is always set to manual mode. And in manual mode, you don't need to use it because you can actually be more precise in setting your exposure, because you can watch either your monitor or your exposure meter read out in your viewfinder or on your monitor to give you a much more precise indication of the exposure and how it's going to look. And you know exactly what your shutter speed will be and what your aperture will be and also what your ISO will be. Whereas if you're using the exposure compensation, it can be a little bit more random and having to guess how much, whether you'll need 1 or 2 stops or more plus or minus of compensation. If you're in manual mode, you can control this all through the aperture, shutter speed and ISO settings yourself. So I hope you've enjoyed this video. I hope it's provided you with some helpful information. If it has, please click that like button, and if you're new to our channel, don't forget to click that subscribe button and hit that bell icon as well so that you'll stay up to date when we release new videos. Thanks for watching.